The torches burned low in rooms that had no names, not because the builders forgot to name them, not because they were unimportant, but because naming a thing makes it recordable, and what happened in those rooms was never meant to be recorded. There is a particular silence that historians learn to recognize. It is not the silence of absence, of events that left no trace. It is a different kind. It is the silence of intention, the silence of a pen lifted mid-sentence, the silence of a man who knows exactly what he witnessed and chooses, deliberately, precisely, not to write it down. That silence has a shape. It appears in the margins of ancient manuscripts. It lives in the gap between one paragraph and the next. Scholars have given it polite names. Lacuna, they say, lost passage, fragmentary source. But when that same gap appears across dozens of texts, written by different hands, in different centuries, in different languages, all describing the same category of event, the same threshold, the same doorway, the same moment before the ceremony begins, then the word coincidence stops being useful. Something was being protected. The question is, what? Every civilization that ever built walls also built secrets inside them. This is not metaphor, it is architecture. In the ruins of temples across the ancient world, from the limestone sanctuaries of the eastern Mediterranean to the carved stone enclosures of the Aegean coast, archaeologists have documented a recurring structural feature: an inner chamber, a room within a room, a door that did not face the public courtyard, a threshold that most people who visited the temple in their entire lives never crossed. The outer precincts were for the people, the inner chamber was for someone else. Ancient writers knew this. They described the outer ceremonies in considerable detail: the processions, the offerings, the dress, the music, the season. They wrote about which god was honored and which hymns were sung and what color the garlands were. They were meticulous about everything they were permitted to describe. And then they stopped. Not because the ceremony stopped. The ceremony continued deeper inside, but the writer's record of it simply ceased, mid-thought sometimes, mid-sentence in at least one surviving case, as though the author remembered himself at the last possible moment and pulled the stylus back from the wax. Later scholars annotated these gaps with careful notes. Here the author refers to the mysteries, or the rites themselves are left undescribed, as if that explained something. As if the gap were a clerical oversight rather than a deliberate act of erasure performed in real time by the man holding the pen. It was not an oversight, it was a choice, and understanding why that choice was made consistently across centuries by educated men who were otherwise perfectly willing to describe battle atrocities and political executions and the detailed symptoms of plague, understanding that consistency is the only way to begin to understand what was being hidden. The ancient world ran on secrecy the way it ran on grain and iron. Not the secrecy of shame, not the furtive, small secrecy of a man hiding a crime, something larger, something architectural. Secrecy as infrastructure, secrecy as a social material with load-bearing properties, something institutions were built on, not merely decorated with. Initiation traditions existed across the ancient world in forms that varied enormously in their surface details, but shared a common skeleton. There was always a threshold, there was always a separation, the initiate removed from ordinary life, from family, from the familiar rhythms of work and sleep. There was always a period of suspension, of in-betweenness, where the person who had entered was no longer what they had been and not yet what they were becoming. And there was always an oath. The oath is where historians encounter the wall. Because oaths in the ancient world were not formalities. They were not the civic paperwork of modern promises. An oath invoked the gods as witnesses. It bound the speaker not merely in this life, but in whatever came after. To break an oath of secrecy was not merely to risk social punishment, exile, dishonor, the withdrawal of community, though those consequences were real and severe. It was to place the soul itself in jeopardy.
To break such an oath was to become a person the gods had watched betray a sacred trust. Ancient writers were educated men. They understood exactly what that meant. This is why the silence held across generations, not because the rituals were forgotten, not because the details were unknown to the people writing the histories, but because the men with the knowledge were also the men with the oath. And the oath was older than the manuscript. The oath was older than the particular institution that administered it. The oath had the weight of the world behind it. You do not write that down.
What fragments survived do not describe the rituals directly. They describe around them, obliquely. The way you might describe a fire by talking about the shadows it casts on a wall rather than looking at the flame itself. From these peripheral observations, historians have spent centuries attempting careful reconstruction, not of the secret itself, which remains genuinely lost, but of the experience, the shape of the thing, the container the secret was held inside. What emerges from that reconstruction is consistent enough to trust, even if its specific contents remain permanently withheld. The initiate was prepared. This preparation was not casual. It involved physical disciplines, fasting in most traditions, purification by water, in some cases prolonged periods of isolation or exposure, depending on the tradition, the season, the severity of the particular rite. The body was being emptied of its ordinary state. This is not metaphor in the sense the ancient world would have understood it. They believed the preparation was literally changing the physical and spiritual condition of the person undergoing it. The initiate who arrived at the threshold after weeks of preparation was genuinely different from the person who had first presented themselves. The preparation was functional, not ceremonial. Then came darkness. This appears in enough scattered references that historians treat it as near certain. The ceremony involved literal darkness, a room without light, a space where the initiate could not see, could not orient, could not rely on the visual certainty that governs normal human experience. Some scholars have interpreted this as theatrical, a dramatic device to heighten the emotional impact of whatever came next. Others believe it was more than theater. Darkness does something specific to the human mind. Without visual anchoring, the brain's sense of self, its sense of boundary, of where the body ends and the world begins, becomes unstable. Documented consistently across traditions that used sensory reduction in initiatory contexts, not as a side effect, as an intentional mechanism. The dissolution of ordinary identity was not a byproduct of the darkness, it was the point of it. What the initiate experienced inside that darkness is what the texts will not say. What they will say, obliquely, carefully, always with the feeling of a man choosing his words while standing very close to a line he will not cross, is that what happened inside changed people, permanently. Not in the vague, inspirational sense that people use the word today, in the specific, documented, observable sense that witnesses recorded afterward. People who had been initiated were different from people who had not. They carried themselves differently. They spoke about certain subjects with a particular quality, not certainty exactly, but settledness, a composure that came from having been through something that could not be communicated, only experienced. One ancient observer, writing in the margins of what he clearly intended as a neutral historical account, allowed himself this single unguarded line, that those who returned from the innermost rites wore the look of men who had been told something that could not be untold. He did not say what it was. Of course he did not. Power has always understood that what is controlled is not just territory and labor and taxation. What is ultimately controlled, in any lasting way, is meaning. The initiation traditions of the ancient world were not separate from political and social power, they were woven through it. In some cases, they were the mechanism through which certain categories of authority were legitimized. The leader who had been initiated could claim a relationship to sacred knowledge that the uninitiated could not contest, because they had no access to the basis of that claim. They were, by structural design, excluded from the evidence. This is how secrecy functions as governance.
It is not crude power, the power of armies and walls and locked doors. It is something more durable, a social architecture in which the uninitiated consent to a hierarchy they cannot fully evaluate, because the criteria for that hierarchy are held inside a room they have never entered and will never enter. The authority of the initiated is self-sealing. The very fact that you cannot assess it from outside confirms to the initiated that you are outside for good reason. This structure appears wherever humans have organized themselves at sufficient scale and complexity. It is not peculiar to any single culture or religion or geography. It is, in some sense, a feature of how human societies manage the distribution of meaning under conditions of significant inequality. The mystery is not incidental to the power. In many cases, the mystery is the power. Ancient writers who lived inside these systems understood this clearly. Some of them wrote about the outer edges of it with impressive lucidity. The social functions, the psychological effects on initiates, the way the traditions bound communities across generations. They could analyze the container with considerable sophistication. But the content of the container, the actual events of the ceremony, the specific knowledge communicated, the nature of the experience in the darkness, that remained sealed. Because to write it would have been to hand the keys to anyone with the ability to read, and the keys were not meant for everyone. The archaeology has been more forthcoming than the texts in certain limited ways. Not because objects speak more freely than words. Objects are also, in their way, deliberate. What a community chose to place inside a sealed chamber, what it chose to leave in the ground beneath a threshold, what it carved into the walls of a room that most people would never see, these are also choices, also forms of intention. What the restricted inner chambers of ancient sanctuaries have yielded in excavations across multiple centuries and multiple regions is a particular category of object, not the grand votive offerings left in public spaces, the inscribed dedications, the costly gifts meant to be seen and admired and associated with a donor's name. What appears in the restricted spaces is different.
Smaller, less demonstrative. Objects that appear to have been used rather than displayed. Objects that bear the marks of repeated handling. Vessels for liquids, implements whose exact function remains debated, items associated with fire and smoke and darkness, and occasionally, rarely but consistently enough to be significant, objects that appear to be representations of the threshold moment itself. Figures caught mid-transformation. Forms that are in the process of becoming something other than what they were. The art of the inner chamber, when it exists at all, is the art of liminality, of the in-between. This fits. It fits the textual fragments. It fits the scattered testimonies of people describing the aftermath of initiation without describing the initiation itself. The archaeology confirms that something happened in these rooms that was concerned fundamentally with transformation, with the movement of a person across a threshold that was not merely physical, but categorical. You entered as one kind of person. You were meant to leave as another. What affected that transformation, what the ceremony actually did to accomplish it, remains in the darkness where it was performed. There is a particular word that appears in multiple ancient languages, applied specifically to these rites, that carries its meaning so precisely that it has survived in modern usage almost unchanged. The word concerns things that must not be spoken, not things that cannot be spoken, as though the limitation were technical, must not. The prohibition is moral, not mechanical. The thing is speakable. A person who had been inside could, in the physical sense, open their mouth and describe it. The choice not to was a choice. The word names that choice. It honors it. It enshrines the decision not to communicate as itself a form of sacred action. This is worth sitting with, because it means the silence was not passive. The ancient world did not keep these secrets because the ceremonies were chaotic and disorganized, because no one was paying careful attention, because memory failed or records deteriorated. The silence was active. The silence was a practice, maintained across generations with the same discipline that was applied to the ceremonies themselves. The people who knew the secret also knew how to keep it. They had been trained in both simultaneously. To know the content of the mystery was inseparable from knowing that the content must not leave the room. The knowledge and the silence were one thing. Many of the traditions that carried these ceremonies did not survive intact. Some were suppressed by political upheaval, by conquest, by the deliberate policy of new powers that understood, correctly, that the authority held inside these traditions was a rival to their own. When a new order wishes to install itself as the sole legitimate source of meaning, the mystery traditions of the old order are not merely inconvenient, they are structurally incompatible. They cannot coexist with a claim to exclusive spiritual authority because they represent a different channel of sacred knowledge, one that the new authority does not control and cannot audit. So they were closed. The inner chambers were sealed or repurposed or dismantled. The initiated, those who remained alive and free, took their knowledge further inward into forms that left even fewer traces. Some traditions transformed, adopted, found vessels that were less visible and therefore less vulnerable. Others simply ended. The last person who knew disappeared, and the knowledge went with them. What the suppression could not entirely reach was the surrounding culture, the traces, the references and texts written before the suppression or written at the margins of it, or written by people who understood that what they were recording was about to be lost and chose to preserve as much of the container as they could while keeping the content sealed. These are the documents that historians work with now, the documents of people who saw the edge of the ceremony, who knew the outer shape, who preserved the vocabulary, the calendar of the rites, the social architecture around them, everything except the center. The center was already gone by the time most of these texts were written, already sealed away, already beginning the process of becoming permanently inaccessible. The question that sits at the edge of all of the scholarship is not merely historical. It is not only about the past. It is about what it means that these traditions existed, what it tells us about the human need that produced them, what it reveals about the relationship between power and secrecy, between identity and ritual, between the desire for transformation and the institutions built to manage and control that desire. Ancient societies did not create elaborate initiation ceremonies because they had nothing else to do. They created them because they were trying to solve problems that every human society faces, problems of meaning, of belonging, of the passage from one state of life to another, of the relationship between the individual and the forces larger than the individual that determine the conditions of existence. The ceremonies were answers. Constructed answers, maintained answers, answers passed down through generations of careful, disciplined practice. The fact that the answers were kept secret does not mean they were fraudulent. Secrecy is not the same as falsehood. The restriction of access to something does not prove that the something is empty. What it proves, what the consistency of the silence proves, is that the people who held these ceremonies believed they were protecting something real, something that had value precisely because it was not universally available, something that could be damaged by exposure, diluted by casual familiarity, diminished by being written down and handed to anyone who could read. They may have been right. The ruins of the sanctuaries still stand in places. Not all of them. Many were quarried for later construction, their stones repurposed for walls and bridges, the sacred geometry of their arrangement dissolved into the utilitarian geometry of roads. But some remain. Enough to walk through, enough to feel the change in scale when you pass from the outer court, which was built to hold crowds, to the narrowing passage that leads toward the inner precincts. You can feel the architecture making a decision. The space is telling you something about who is permitted to proceed. The width of the path decreases. The light changes. The quality of the stonework shifts, Not cruder, but different, serving different purposes, built to different specifications. And then the door, or what remains of it. A threshold in most surviving cases, the door itself long gone, the frame intact, or partly intact. A stone lintel that once held the boundary between the world of the uninitiated and the world that the initiated entered. Scholars who have stood at these thresholds have noted that what they feel there is not primarily intellectual. It is not the feeling of historical curiosity, of academic interest in what once occurred. It is something more immediate. Something about the architecture itself communicates the weight of what the space was built to hold, the seriousness of the people who built it, the absolute certainty, carried in the proportions and the stone and the darkness beyond the threshold, that what happened past this point was not casual, that it mattered, that something real was being done here, to real people, with real consequences that followed them out of this room and into the rest of their lives. And that the people who built this room knew exactly what they were doing and chose, with the full force of their considerable intelligence and their considerable care, not to write it down. The most powerful things in history were rarely the things that were announced. The declarations were for the crowd, the proclamations were for the record. The ceremonies conducted in daylight with music and procession and witnessing, those were the frame around the painting. Visible, preserved, available to anyone with access to an archive. The painting itself was kept somewhere else, in a room with no windows, on a night that was not recorded, in the presence of people who had sworn, on everything they held sacred, on everything that would matter to them past the boundary of this life, to carry what they witnessed in silence to whatever came after. They kept that oath. Most of them kept it completely. The silence held. The center of the tradition became unreachable. It receded behind the fragments, behind the careful gaps in the manuscripts, behind the oblique references of writers who knew and chose not to say. What remains is the shape of the absence, the outline of something that was once present and is now gone. The architecture of the room, the width of the threshold, the darkness on the other side of the door, and the knowledge that human beings crossed that threshold for centuries and were changed by what they found there, and never told anyone exactly what it was. Some truths were never meant to survive their keepers. The silence itself was the final ceremony, and it was performed without a single error. No archive holds what was spoken in those rooms. No translation can recover what was carried out through those doors. The initiated took their knowledge the only place it could never be seized, inward, beyond reach, beyond record. What remains is the threshold, the unmarked stone, the empty chamber, the gap in the manuscript where the sentence simply stops. History remembers what people chose to preserve, but the deepest truths were the ones people chose to bury with themselves.